On the morning of October the 7th, 1884, Eli Marsh carried the last stone up from the riverbank and set it in place above the buried tin. He did not mark the spot. He did not stand back to admire the work. He brushed the silt from his palms against the rough wool of his trousers and walked back down the slope to the river to count what remained. There were 499 stones still scattered along the gravel bar. He had counted them in May. He had counted them in June. He counted them again now, as a man counts the buttons on a coat he has worn for a long time, not from doubt but from habit. The river ran low and clear, and the cottonwoods on the far bank had turned the color of old brass. The boy was up at the cabin, asleep in the loft, and the cabin was quiet, and the smoke from the stovepipe rose straight up into a sky that promised nothing. Eli was 36 years old that autumn. His wife had been dead for 3 winters. His son was 7. The cabin sat on a flat shoulder of land above the Powder River in the Wyoming Territory, in a country that did not forgive softness and did not reward haste. Eli had come into that country with a wagon and a woman and an infant in 1879, and he had left it once, in the spring of 1881, to bury the woman in her family's plot in Missouri. And he had come back alone with the boy because the boy had nowhere else to go, and because Eli had nowhere else either. He had a quarter section, a sound team, a milk cow that gave thinly, and a habit of watching the weather the way other men watched cards. He was, the neighbors said, a quiet man. They meant it kindly at first. Later they meant other things by it. The first stone had gone into the ground on a Tuesday in April of 1882. He had been thinking about it through the whole long winter that followed his burial, and his wife's burial. Had spent alone with the boy in the cabin while the wind came down off the bighorns and pried at every seam in the chinking. That winter had not been a bad one by the standards of the country. It had only been ordinary. And ordinary, he had decided sometime in February, with the boy curled against his chest under 3 wool blankets and a buffalo hide, was not enough. Ordinary meant living from one thaw to the next. Ordinary meant the cow's milk thinning in March, and the flower going weevily in April, and the boy's cheeks going hollow in the long gap before the garden came in. Ordinary was the gait of a man who would one day fail. He had read, that winter, a thin pamphlet a freighter had left in trade for a meal. It was about water, about the way water moved through ground and stone, about the way certain rocks held cold and certain rocks held heat, about the way a spring could be coaxed if a man understood the slope it ran beneath. The pamphlet was written by a Welshman who had worked the lead mines in Pennsylvania and then come west and put what he knew about ore into what he had learned about prairie. Eli read it 3 times, then he read it again. By the time the snow began to soften on the south side of the cabin, he had a notion that was not yet a plan but had the shape of one. He needed a place to keep water that would not freeze. He needed a place to keep food that would not spoil. He needed both of those places to be close enough to the cabin that a man with a child could reach them in a storm, and hidden enough that they could not be plundered by a passing rider with bad intentions. And he needed the whole thing to last beyond him, in case it had to. He started with the spring. There was a seep on the north slope behind the cabin, in a fold of land where 2 low ridges came together. He had seen it the first spring he came onto the land. A darkening of the soil and a thin trickle that disappeared into the grass before it had traveled 6 feet. Most men would have called it nothing. Eli had walked the slope above it with a forked willow branch the way his grandfather had taught him in Missouri, and the branch had pulled toward the ground at one particular spot 20 yards uphill. He had marked the spot with a flat stone. He had said nothing to anyone. That had been in 1880. And he had let the marker sit untouched for 2 full years while he thought about it. In the April of 1882, with the frost barely out, he began to dig. He dug for 9 days, alone, with a long-handled spade and a pick, taking the boy with him in a sling when the boy was small enough and later setting him on a folded blanket at the edge of the hole, with a tin cup and a wooden spoon for company. He dug down through the topsoil and into the heavy clay, and then into a layer of broken shale that took the edge off his pick and made his hands bleed through the leather of his gloves. At 12 feet down, water came up to meet him, not a trickle. A true cold push of it, clean enough to drink from the bucket, steady enough that by morning the hole he had left overnight had filled to within 4 feet of the surface and stopped there as if a hand were holding it. He had found the spring. Now he had to keep it. He spent the rest of that summer lining the shaft with stone. Not just any stone, river stone. round, water-worn, smoothed by 10,000 years of current, the kind of stone a man could lay tight without mortar if he understood how the curves wanted to nest. He hauled the stones up from the powder, 1 and 2 at a time, in a canvas sling slung over the cow's flank because the cow did not mind the work and the team was needed for other things. He stacked them on the slope beside the shaft. By August he had 800 stones. By September he had laid 400 of them into the walls of the shaft, fitting each one by hand, packing the gaps with clay and finer gravel, working from the bottom up by the light of a tin lantern lowered on a rope. The shaft, when he was done, was a perfect cylinder 11 feet deep and 4 feet across, lined in stone the color of old bone, with the spring pushing up through the gravel at the bottom and a small overflow notched into the lip at ground level to carry the excess down toward the cabin in a buried trough. He capped the shaft with a slab of sandstone he had quarried himself and dragged across the slope on rollers. Over the slab he laid 2 feet of earth. Over the earth he set sod. By the first frost of October the spring shaft was invisible. A man could have walked across it and felt nothing but firm ground. That had been year 1, the neighbors had noticed, of course. The country was not so empty that a man could move 800 stones up a hillside without being seen. The first to mention it, gently, was a woman named Pearl Hatcher, who rode over in late June with a basket of dried apples and a question disguised as small talk. Pearl was 60 years old, the widow of a Methodist circuit preacher, and she had taken it upon herself in the years after Eli's wife died to ride out once a season and look at the boy. She did not pry, she accepted coffee. She asked, that day, what he was doing on the north slope with all those stones, and he had said truthfully that he was building a well. She had nodded and said that was sensible, and then she had ridden home and told her son-in-law, who told the man at the mill, who told 3 other men by the end of the week. By harvest, the country knew that Eli Marsh was building a well that was taking him a long time, and the country thought no more about it. That was the first form of the mockery, and it was not really mockery. It was puzzlement. It would change. The boy's name was Samuel. He was 4 years old in the summer of 1882, and he watched his father work the way a small child watches anything, without judgment, with absolute attention, with a willingness to be inside the work without understanding it. He carried stones in his small hands when he could lift them. He sat at the edge of the shaft and dropped pebbles into the water and listened for the sound. He learned, in that summer, to recognize the difference between a round stone and a flat one, the difference between a stone that would seat and a stone that would rock, and he learned the word seep, and the word shale, and the word plumb, and he learned that his father did not waste motion, and did not waste words, and did not waste days. These were not lessons Eli set out to teach. They were what was in the air the boy breathed. The first hard frost came on the 11th of October that year. Eli stood on the slope in the morning and looked at his cabin and his cow and his well and his small son in the doorway, and he understood that he had finished one thing and that he had only barely begun. He went inside and made coffee. He sat at the table with the boy and ate biscuits and bacon. He took down the pamphlet from the shelf and read it a 5th time. Then he turned it over, and on the blank back page he wrote, in pencil, in the slow, careful hand of a man who had not done much schooling, food, then heat, then the wall. That was the plan. He carried it forward for 2 more years. Winter passed, the boy turned 5, the cow calved, the flower held out. The spring, sealed beneath its sod cap, did not freeze. In February, Eli broke the cap once to check, and the water came up to meet him exactly as it had in October. And the temperature of it on his wrist was the temperature of stone that has lived underground all its life. Neither warm nor cold, but simply itself. He resealed the cap and walked back to the cabin and slept that night the way a man sleeps when one thing in his life is no longer in question. In the spring of 1883 he began on the food. He had thought about this longer than he had thought about the water. Water was a single problem with a single solution. Food was 100 problems, each with its own season and its own enemy. He had thought about it through the entire winter. He had decided sometime in January that the ordinary root cellar dug under the cabin floor was not enough. It was too warm in summer and too close to the surface in winter. It would freeze in a long cold snap and rot in a long warm one. He needed something else. He needed 2 things, actually. A place that stayed cool and dry through summer for grain and smoked meat, and a place that stayed above freezing through winter for root vegetables and what he might preserve in jars. He laid them both into the same hillside, 20 yards east of the spring shaft, on a south-facing slope where the winter sun would touch the roof and the summer afternoons would not. He dug for 16 days. He dug a chamber 8 feet by 10, 6 feet high at the back wall and 4 feet high at the entrance, set into the slope so that 3 of its 4 walls were earth. He lined the walls with the same round river stone he had used for the spring, fitted dry, packed with clay. The floor he laid with flat slate quarried from a creek 2 miles east, set on a bed of sand, sloped slightly toward a small drain hole at the back that ran out through a buried clay pipe into the grass below. The roof he framed with cottonwood beams, cut and seasoned the previous fall, covered with split planks, covered with a layer of birch bark he had gathered in long strips from a stand-up near the tong, covered with 2 feet of packed clay, covered with sod. The door was a double door, an inner door of pine planks set into a heavy frame, an outer door of oak set 6 inches outside the inner one, with the space between them packed loosely with dry chaff and shavings, dead air. The Welshman's pamphlet had not taught him that. An old German immigrant named Krause had, 2 valleys over, who had built his own cellar that way after the manner of his grandfather's farm in Saxony. Eli had walked the 18 miles to Krause's place in March of 1883, with a sack of cornmeal as a gift and a list of questions in his head. Krause had spoken broken English and Eli had spoken no German, and yet by the end of an afternoon they had understood each other completely. The way 2 men who have built things with their hands can always understand each other. Krause had drawn him a picture in the dirt with a stick. Eli had carried that picture home in his mind and built it. The cellar was finished by the first frost of 1883. The grain went in. The smoked meat went in. Pearl Hatcher rode over in November with a jar of plum preserves and looked at the new mound in the hillside and asked him, this time with a small line between her eyebrows, what he was up to now. He had said truthfully that he was building a place to keep food. She had said that was sensible, and then she had said, more quietly, that it looked like a lot of work for 1 man and a small boy. He had said it was. She had not said anything else about it, but as she rode out she had turned in her saddle and looked back at the slope, and Eli, watching from the cabin door, had understood that puzzlement had begun to turn into something else. By then, the talk in town had taken a shape. He heard about it from the man at the mill in late November, when he went in to grind a sack of wheat. The man at the mill was named Cobb. Cobb was about Eli's age, a heavy man with a heavy laugh. Not a cruel man, but a man who said what he thought without first running it through the courtesy a smaller man would have used. Cobb had taken the sack and weighed it and started the mill, and over the noise of the stones he had said, Eli, what, in God's name, are you digging up there? Half the county thinks you're building a fort. The other half thinks you're hiding gold. Pearl Hatcher thinks you've gone strange in the head since Ada died, and she's the only one of us still being polite about it. Eli had said it was a cellar. A cellar, Cobb had said and laughed. A cellar takes a man 2 weeks. You've been at it 3 years. Eli had said 2 years. Cobb had laughed again. 3, 2. Long time for a hole in the ground. Eli had taken his flour and paid and ridden home. He had not been angry. He had not even been hurt. Cobb's laughter had been the laughter of a man who had not yet seen a thing he could not explain, and Eli had no quarrel with such men. The country was full of them. The country was, in fact, mostly them. He had ridden home, and that evening, after the boy was asleep, he had taken down his pencil and his pamphlet, and on the back page beneath the line he had written 2 years before he wrote a new one. Heat. The wall. Begin in May. That was the 2nd year. He carried it through. In the spring of 1884 he began the 3rd thing. The thing he had been thinking about since the first night his wife had been in the ground, and he had lain alone in the cabin, with the wind pulling at the chinking and the boy a small warm weight against his side. He had thought, that night, that the cabin was not enough. The cabin was a box of pine planks and clay and tar paper, and the wind found every seam, and a hard winter would one day take it apart board by board the way the wind had taken apart other cabins he had seen, the abandoned ones along the trail with their roofs sagged in and their doors hanging from one hinge. He needed the cabin to be more than a cabin. He needed a wall that was not a wall. A thing that stood between his son and the wind in a way the wind could not understand. He built it that summer. He built it on the north and west sides of the cabin, the sides the winter wind came from. He built it 4 feet out from the cabin wall, leaving a corridor of dead space between the cabin proper and the new structure. He built it of stone, river stone again, the same patient stones from the same patient river, laid in a double course with rubble packed in between, 6 feet high and 2 feet thick, with a sod roof sloped down toward the cabin so that snow would drift against the outer face of the new wall and not against the cabin itself. The drift, when it came, would become its own insulation. The dead corridor between the wall and the cabin, lined with chaff and old buffalo hide, would hold the cabin's heat. The Welshman had not taught him this either. He had reasoned it out himself, sitting by his cook fire one evening in May, watching the way the smoke rose against a still cottonwood and thinking about the way snow had banked against the lee side of a haystack he had passed in February. A haystack stayed warm at its center even in a 40-below night. The hay did not make heat. The hay only held what heat was already there. A wall could do the same, if a man built it right. He built it through May and June and July of 1884. He moved another 400 stones. The cow's flank had a permanent patch of rubbed bare hide from the sling. The boy, now 6, could lift a stone the size of his own head and carry it 10 feet before he set it down, and Eli let him do it because the boy needed to feel useful and because the work would be his one day, all of it. And a child who knew the weight of a stone would not be afraid of stones when he grew. They worked together in the long summer evenings until the light failed, and then they walked down to the river and washed the dust from their hands and arms in the cold current. And the boy talked about what he had carried and where he had put it, and Eli listened the way a man listens to a sermon he has heard before but loves. That summer was when the mockery turned its third face. It came from a man named Asa Bell. Asa was Eli's age, almost to the month. He had ridden into the country the same year Eli had, with the same wagon kind, the same axe, the same hopes. Their wives had been friends. When Ada had died, Asa had been one of the men who dug the grave back in Missouri, having traveled with Eli on that long, sorrowful trip east, and Asa had ridden back west with him and had sat with him through the first hard nights after the burial without saying much, which was the kind of friendship Eli understood. Asa was the closest thing he had in the country to a brother. Asa rode up to the cabin on a warm Sunday in July, swung down off his horse, looked at the new wall, and stood with his hands on his hips for a long time without saying anything. Then he sat down on a stump and Eli brought him water and they drank together, and Asa said, "Eli, I want to ask you something, and I want you to hear it as a friend." Eli said he was listening. 3 years, Asa said. "You've been at this 3 years now. The well, the cellar, this wall. You haven't planted what you could have planted. You haven't run the cattle you could have run. The Hendersons have offered to lease your south pasture, and you haven't said yes or no. You've just kept on with the stones. Eli, I knew Ada. She wouldn't have wanted you to do this. She wouldn't have wanted you to lose 3 years of a man's life building a thing nobody can name." Eli set his cup down. He looked at Asa. He looked past him at the boy, who was sitting in the shade of the cabin with a piece of harness leather and an awl, working on a small repair that Eli had shown him the week before. He looked at the wall, half finished, the stones gray in the strong sunlight. "I'm not lost," he said. "I didn't say you were lost," Asa said. "I said you might be." Eli nodded slowly. He said, "I know what I'm building. Tell me then." But Eli could not tell him. He could not put it into the kind of words that would have satisfied Asa, who was a practical man and would have wanted a practical answer about square footage and feed costs and acres under plow. The wall was not a practical thing. The wall was a long answer to a question Eli could not yet articulate even to himself. A question about what a man owed his son who had no mother, about what a man owed a country that had taken his wife, about what a man did with the unbearable weight of being responsible for another life, in a place that did not care whether either of them survived. The stones were the answer. The stones were the only answer he had. He could not say that to Asa. He said only, "Trust me a little longer." Asa had looked at him for a long time. Then he had stood up and put his hat back on and said, "Eli, I do trust you. That's what worries me." And he had ridden away. That was the cutting line. It was not Cobb's laughter. It was Asa's worry. A man can bear ridicule from those who do not know him. The worry of a friend who does know him is harder to set aside. Eli stood at the cabin door and watched Asa ride down the slope and across the creek and out of sight, and he did not move for a long time. Then he went back to the wall and laid the next stone, and the next, and the next. The wall was finished on the morning of October the 7th, 1884, when he set the last stone above the buried tin at the corner where the new wall met the old cabin. The tin contained, sealed in wax, a copy of his deed, a lock of Ada's hair, and a single sheet of paper on which he had written the names of every man and woman who had helped him through the years since her death. Pearl Hatcher, the man Kraus, the Welshman whose pamphlet had started it all, Asa Bell. He buried the tin because he had read once that the old peoples of the country buried things at the corners of what they built, not as offerings but as memory. The tin was memory. The wall was for the boy. That was where this story began. That was the morning he counted the 499 stones still on the gravel bar. He had moved 1,070 stones in 3 years. He had built a well, a cellar, and a wall. He had lined 2 of those structures with 500 stones each, and 1,000 stones is a thing a man feels in his shoulders for the rest of his life. He stood by the river that morning and felt them all. He walked back up to the cabin. The boy was awake now, sitting at the table eating biscuits with honey. The cabin was warm. The stovepipe drew clean. Eli sat down across from his son and looked at him for a long while without speaking. The boy was 7 years old. His mother had been dead for almost 4 years. He had been a part of every piece of work Eli had done for half his life. He did not yet know what was coming for them. Neither did Eli, exactly. But Eli had been reading the sky for weeks now, and the sky was reading wrong. The geese had gone south 2 weeks early. The muskrats along the river had built their lodges higher than he had ever seen them. The cow's winter coat had come in by the 3rd week of September, thick and dense in a way that ordinary winters did not call for. The bark on the south side of the cottonwoods was thicker than the north side by a margin he did not like. He had walked the high ground east of the cabin in the last week of September and found the grass already brittle, the grasshoppers gone, the ant mound sealed unusually tight. None of these things alone meant anything. All of them together meant something. He did not say any of this to the boy. He poured himself coffee and sat and watched the boy eat. When the boy was finished, Eli sent him out to the cow with a tin pail, and the boy went, and Eli sat alone at the table for a few minutes with his hands wrapped around the warm cup. Then he stood up and walked out to the new wall and laid his palm against the stones. And the stones were already cool with the autumn morning but not cold. They held what they were given. They would do what he had built them to do, or they would not. There was no way to know yet. There would not be any way to know until the country told him. The first snow came on the 14th of October. It was a light snow, a polite snow, the kind that dusts the sage and melts by noon. The second snow came on the 21st and stayed 3 days. The third snow came on the 2nd of November and did not leave. By the middle of the month, the country was white from the river bottoms to the high benches, and the temperature at night was dropping below 0 and not coming back up until mid-morning. Eli moved the cow into the lean-to attached to the cabin. He brought the hens into a small coop he had built against the new wall, where the dead-air corridor kept them from freezing. He brought wood. He brought more wood. He brought, finally, enough wood to last until April, stacked in cords against the inside of the new wall, where it would dry and be ready and never have to be carried through a storm. He went down into the cellar in the 2nd week of November and inventoried what was there. Smoked elk, smoked pork, a barrel of saltfish from a trader who had come through in September, 12 sacks of flour, 6 sacks of cornmeal, a barrel of beans, a barrel of dried apples, jars of plum preserves, jars of pickled beets, jars of pickled cucumbers, jars of honey, onions and potatoes and turnips and carrots in their bins of sand. A wheel of cheese Krause had given him in trade for a day's labor in August. Enough for 2 people for a year, if the year was hard. Enough for 3 or 4 people for a winter, if a winter was what was needed. He went up to the well shaft on a still cold morning in November and lifted the sod cap and looked down. The water moved beneath him, dark and steady, the surface unfrozen even with the cold sitting on the country like a hand. He lowered the bucket and brought it up full, and drank from it standing there on the slope. And the water tasted of stone and was the temperature of stone. And he set the bucket down and resealed the cap and walked back to the cabin. He was, that month, almost calm. He had been waiting 3 years and the waiting was over. The thing he had built was now between him and the country could do what it wanted. He had prepared for cold. He had prepared for hunger. He had prepared for the wind and the snow and the long, dark afternoons. He had prepared for the cow going dry and the hens stopping their laying and the trail being closed for 6 weeks at a stretch. He had prepared for himself and for the boy. He had not prepared for the sound of a child crying on the other side of the wall. The storm came on the morning of December the 8th. It came the way the worst of them always come. Not from the west where a man watches, but from the north, sliding down off the bighorns in a long gray sheet that swallowed the country in an hour. The light went first, then the sound, then the temperature, which dropped from 12 above to 20 below in the space of an afternoon and kept dropping. By dark of that first day, the wind was running steady at 40 miles an hour, with gusts over 60. And the snow was coming sideways, and a man who stepped outside the cabin would not have been able to see his own outstretched hand. Inside the cabin, the stove burned slow and steady. The boy slept in the loft under 3 wool blankets and a buffalo hide. Eli sat at the table with the lamp turned low and listened to the wind and read, again, the pamphlet that had started it all. The wind did not find a single seam in the chinking. The new wall to the north and west took the brunt of the gale, and the cabin behind it was a held breath of warm air. The dead corridor between the wall and the cabin was already filling with drifted snow on the outside, and the snow on the wall's outer face was thickening by the hour, and Eli, who had built for this exact thing, sat at his table and felt the cabin grow, if anything, warmer as the storm worsened. He should have been content. He was not. He was thinking about Asa Bell. He was thinking about the Hendersons 3 miles south, and the Mitchell family 2 miles west, and the widow Pearl Hatcher alone in her small house at the edge of town. He was thinking about Cobb at the mill and Krause 2 valleys over. He was thinking about every cabin in the country that had not been built by a man who spent 3 years moving stones. He was thinking about the children in those cabins. He had not prepared for the thought of them. He had prepared for everything else. He sat at the table a long time. The wind rose and fell and rose. The boy slept. The stove ticked. Eli sat in the warmth he had built over 3 years and wondered, briefly, whether a man who prepared this carefully had missed something about how to live, whether the wall he had built was a wall against the country or a wall against the people in it, whether the patience he had practiced for 3 years was patience or only a kind of pride that had not yet learned its name. He stood up. He went to the door. He opened the inner door and the outer door and looked out into the corridor between the cabin and the wall. And the corridor was dark and warm and still, and beyond the wall the storm was screaming. He could not have gone out into it. No man could have. He closed the doors. He went back to the table. He sat down. The storm ran for 4 days. On the second day the boy woke and asked him quietly whether the others were all right. Eli had not known the boy was thinking about it. He had not known the boy was old enough to think about it. He said, honestly, that he did not know. The boy nodded and accepted this and went back to his small tasks, feeding the hens through the wall hatch, watching the cow, drawing pictures on a slate with a piece of soft chalk. He did not ask again. But Eli saw, in the way the boy stood at the window now and then, and looked at the white wall of the storm, that the question had not left him. On the third day the wind eased a little, not much, enough that Eli could open the outer door and shovel a path through the corridor to the lean-to and check the cow, who was placid and warm and chewing slowly at her hay, enough that he could open the small port he had set into the new wall, a port he had built without knowing why, the way a man sometimes builds a thing because the building tells him to, and look out across the slope toward the south. He could not see much. The storm was still running, but in a moment of clearing between gusts, he saw something move on the slope below the cabin. Something small, something dark against the snow. He watched it for a long time. It moved and stopped and moved and stopped, and at last he understood that it was a person, that the person was crawling, and that the person was small. He closed the port. He told the boy to stay in the cabin and not to move from the stove. He put on every piece of wool he owned. He pulled the heavy buffalo coat over all of it. He took a rope from the hook by the door and tied one end to the iron ring he had set into the cabin wall for exactly this kind of need 3 years before. A ring he had set and never used and almost forgotten. A ring that was the kind of thing a man patient enough to move 1,000 stones thinks of. And he tied the other end around his own waist. He opened the doors. He went out into the storm. He found her 30 yards below the cabin, crawling on her hands and knees, and she was 9 years old, and her name, when she could finally speak it, was Mary Bell. She was Asa's daughter. Asa's cabin was 4 miles south. Asa and his wife and their other 2 children were in that cabin, or had been when Mary set out. Their roof had begun to give way on the second day of the storm. Asa had braced it with what he had, and on the morning of the third day, with the roof sagging and the stove failing and her mother feverish, Mary had been sent. She had been sent because she was the lightest and the fastest, and because Eli's cabin was the only one within reach of a child on foot, and because Asa, in the worst hour of his life, had remembered the stones. Eli carried her back through the corridor and through the doors and laid her by the stove. The boy brought blankets. The boy brought broth. The boy did not need to be told. Eli sat with Mary by the fire and worked the feeling back into her small hands and her small feet, and when she could speak she told him about the roof, and about her mother, and about her father, who had told her, when he sent her, "Find Eli. Tell him I was wrong. Tell him to come." Eli looked at his son. The boy looked back at him. The boy was 7 years old, and his eyes were his mother's eyes. Eli stood up. He went to the door. He looked out into the storm, which was still running, though the wind was less than it had been. He thought about the 4 miles. He thought about the rope and the lantern and the team, and the sled he had built 2 summers before and never used. He thought about his son alone in the cabin with a strange child if he did not come back. He thought about Asa, who had sent his daughter into a blizzard because he had remembered the stones. He turned to the boy. He said only, "I have to go." The boy nodded. The boy was already moving, pulling out the second buffalo coat, pulling down the long coil of rope from the rafter, finding the lantern, finding the matches, doing the things he had been raised in the doing of, without ever being told he was being raised for them. Eli watched him for a moment and felt, in his chest, something break and reset that he had not known was broken. He went. He came back at dusk with the team and the sled and Asa's wife and Asa's 2 younger children. And Asa's wife was alive but barely, and the children were frostbit and silent, and the smallest one had to be carried. And Eli brought them all through the corridor, and through the 2 doors, and into the cabin he had built, and the warmth he had stored for 3 years. Against a day he could not have named in advance, he laid them by the stove. He brought them broth from the cellar. He brought them water from the spring that had not frozen. He brought them blankets and dry wool and the buffalo hide from his own bed. The boy worked beside him, silent, competent, the way a child works who has been raised inside a long preparation. Asa, when he could speak, looked at Eli across the fire and said, "I'm sorry." Eli shook his head. He said, "Tell me what you need next." That was all he said. That was all he needed to say. The wall around them held. The cellar below them held. The spring beneath them held. The storm went on for 1 more day and then broke on the morning of December the 13th, and the country lay under 5 feet of new snow and a temperature of 32 below. And in 3 other cabins within 5 miles of the Marsh place, there were people who would not survive the winter. And in the Marsh cabin, there were 8 people warm and fed and alive. The Mitchells came on the 14th, on foot, 2 adults and 1 child, having lost their barn and most of their feed and the use of their cabin's north wall. The Hendersons came on the 15th, having burned the last of their furniture for heat. Pearl Hatcher came on the 17th, brought by her son-in-law on a borrowed sled, half frozen and not quite herself but alive. By Christmas Eve, there were 14 people in a cabin built for 2. They slept in shifts. They ate from the cellar that had been stocked for 1 winter and would now have to stretch through 3 more months. Eli rationed quietly, without explanation, and the rationing held, because he had built the cellar against exactly this kind of need, without ever quite admitting to himself that this was the need he had been building against. He did not say a word about the years of work. He did not say a word about the wall, or the spring, or the cellar. He did not have to. The wall said it. The spring said it. The cellar said it. The 14 people warming themselves at his stove on the longest night of the year said it. Asa Bell said nothing at all, but he sat near the door and looked at Eli, now and then, with an expression Eli could not quite read and did not need to. On Christmas morning, Eli took down the pamphlet from the shelf, and on the back page, beneath the lines he had written in 1881 and 1882 and 1883, he wrote one more. They came. The stones held. Begin again in May. He folded the pamphlet and put it away. He did not show it to anyone. Spring came late that year, the way it does after a winter like that. The snow was still on the high benches in May. The river ran high through June. By the time the country had dried enough to plow, half the families in the valley were rebuilding roofs, walls, barns, fences. Eli went out to help. He helped Asa first, then the Mitchells, then the Hendersons. He worked without speaking much. He built where they would let him, with stone where they had used timber, and with double walls where they had used single, and with corridors of dead air where they had used nothing at all. Some of them listened. Most of them did. The man Cobb, When Eli came to the mill in July to grind that year's wheat, did not laugh. He weighed the sack and started the stones and said only, "Eli, what are you working on this summer?" Eli said he was building a smokehouse. Cobb nodded. He said, "How long will it take you?" Eli said, 2 years, maybe 3. Cobb did not laugh. He nodded again, slowly. And he said, "I'd like to come up and see it sometime when you've got it going. If that's all right." Eli said it was all right. He walked out into the summer afternoon with his sack of flour and rode home to the cabin, and to the boy Gare, and to the stones along the river that he had not yet finished counting. There were still stones left. There would always be stones. The river kept making them, slowly, the way it had been making them for 10,000 years, and a man with patience could move them, one at a time, into the shape of a life that would hold. The man who prepares for a storm he may not live to see is either a fool or the only wise man in the valley. Time tends to settle that argument. If this story stayed with you, the next one is already waiting by the fire.